My private pool, my sanctuary, was constantly invaded, leaving me powerless and frustrated. Karen Wilson, the brazen neighbor who ignored all boundaries, treated my backyard like her personal party zone. But then I devised a clever plan that turned the tables completely, using strategy instead of confrontation. And just wait until you see how everything unfolded, and why justice, in the end, finally prevailed. I'm Jason Harris, and I've always taken pride in my little slice of paradise, a cozy backyard with a sparkling private pool. It wasn't just a pool, it was my sanctuary, the one place where I could completely shut out the world after long, stressful days at work. The smell of chlorine mixed with fresh-cut grass, the gentle hum of the fountain, the soft lounge chairs bathed in afternoon sun. It all felt like my personal retreat. I had spent years designing it, carefully choosing the plants, laying the tiles just right, and even installing subtle lighting that made evenings magical. Every detail mattered because, for me, this wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about creating a space where my family and I could recharge, relax, and reconnect. Then Karen Wilson moved into our neighborhood. At first, she seemed like a typical new neighbor, smiling, waving, introducing herself with all the charm someone new in the HOA tries to muster. But I quickly realized that charm was only a mask. Almost immediately, she started making herself overly familiar with everyone's business, especially mine. At first, it was subtle. A hello here, a casual chat by the mailbox there. But then it escalated. One afternoon, I heard the familiar shrill of her voice carrying across the fence. I peeked out, only to see Karen lounging by my pool, completely uninvited, sipping a drink like she owned the place. I froze, disbelief washing over me. I had locked the gate, yet somehow she had made her way in. My first reaction was polite surprise. I stepped outside and said, Karen, this is my private pool. Did you? She waved me off with a dismissive laugh. Oh, come on, Jason. It's just a pool. Everyone should enjoy it. I blinked at her, searching for some hint that she was joking, but there was none. She had brought a couple of her friends with her, and they were already lounging on my chairs, tossing beach balls into my pool. My heart sank, a flicker of anger beginning to rise. I politely asked them to leave, expecting some acknowledgement, some sign of respect. But instead, Karen smiled and said, "Relax, Jason. We'll be gone in a bit." It was the first moment I realized that she didn't just bend the rules, she didn't recognize their existence at all. The situation didn't stop there, it escalated quickly. Within weeks, Karen's visits became a recurring event. She would arrive unannounced, sometimes bringing friends, sometimes even neighbors I barely knew, and turn my peaceful retreat into a noisy, chaotic gathering. There was laughter, music, splashing, and talking over each other, all echoing through my backyard. I remember one particular afternoon when I had just returned from a brutal day at work. I opened the gate, hoping to find a quiet moment by the pool, only to see Karen sprawled across my deck, sunscreen glistening, surrounded by half a dozen people, drinks in hand, and one of them had even borrowed my pool floaties. My jaw dropped. I felt a hot surge of anger. This wasn't just rude, it was brazen, almost disrespectful to the point of disbelief. I tried to reason with her, calmly explaining that this was a private pool, that I had spent countless hours maintaining it, and that these uninvited visits were disruptive. Karen, however, had perfected the art of brushing off responsibility. "Jason, you're too uptight." "It's a neighborhood pool today," she said, with a smile that made it clear she thought I was overreacting. That smile, paired with her casual disregard for my words, was like a spark to dry kindling. I could feel the heat of anger bubbling inside me, threatening to boil over. How could someone be so entitled, so careless about boundaries? The breaking point came one weekend when she showed up with 10 people. 10. My entire backyard felt invaded. Chairs were stacked where they didn't belong, towels were strewn across the deck, and plastic cups littered the edges of my pool. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the chaos, a mix of disbelief and fury washing over me. I had never felt such a blatant disregard for someone's personal space. It was more than frustration. It was violation. My private sanctuary, the place I had meticulously built and nurtured, had been reduced to a scene of disorder by someone who seemed to care about nothing but her own amusement. That was the moment I realized Karen wasn't going to stop unless something changed. Politeness had failed, subtle hints had failed, and even gentle requests had failed. My anger reached its peak, simmering beneath the surface like a storm ready to break. Every time I thought about those afternoons, my chest tightened. How could someone so audaciously dismiss another person's rights? How could she continue to treat my home as if it were public property? The injustice of it all was undeniable, and I knew that if I didn't act soon, this chaos would become the new normal. I had a choice: continue to let her take over my space, or find a way to reclaim it. And as I stared at the mess that afternoon, anger burning hotter with each passing second, I knew deep down that this was just the beginning of a story I was about to write. One where I refused to let my private world be trampled without a fight. After the first few chaotic encounters with Karen Wilson at my pool, my life began to feel like it was slipping through my fingers. What had once been a peaceful retreat, a place where I could let go of the day's stress, became a source of constant anxiety. Every afternoon, as the sun began to dip in the sky and the golden light kissed the water's surface, I found myself holding my breath, half expecting to see Karen appear over the fence with her entourage of friends. Even when I tried to distract myself at work, my mind would wander back to my backyard. I imagined the laughter, the splashing, the chairs knocked over, and the plastic cups floating in my pool. The anticipation was suffocating. I started to notice the toll it was taking on me, both mentally and physically. Simple pleasures, like reading a book by the pool or listening to music while enjoying a glass of iced tea, now came with an underlying tension. My heart would pound at the thought of another uninvited visit. I found myself checking the time obsessively, almost waiting for the inevitable disruption. Even weekends, which were supposed to be restful, became a battlefield of nerves. I felt trapped in my own home, a place that should have been my sanctuary now laced with apprehension. In an attempt to regain some control, I reached out to the HOA multiple times. I wrote emails, attended meetings, and tried to present my case politely, detailing Karen's repeated intrusions. I hoped that the authority of the HOA would restore some sense of order, but each time the response was disappointing. Some neighbors nodded sympathetically, but said little. Others shrugged, muttering, "She's always like that." Their indifference stung almost as much as the invasions themselves. It felt as though my complaints were invisible, floating into a void where no action would ever be taken. The weight of being unheard compounded my frustration and left me feeling powerless. My relationship with my backyard transformed too. What had once been a space of joy now carried a constant edge of anxiety. I hesitated before opening the gate, double-checked every lock, and planned my days around whether Karen might appear. The freedom I once felt around my own pool had vanished. Every day I became more aware of her potential presence, constantly anticipating the moment my sanctuary would be invaded again. The mere thought of her showing up sent shivers down my spine, and each imagined scenario felt like a tiny violation all over again. Even at home, the stress seeped into my family life. Laura, my wife, noticed the changes in me immediately. She tried to help, asking questions and offering support, but I could see the concern in her eyes. My tone became sharper, my patience thinner, and I snapped at little things I never would have before. Dinner conversations were punctuated with moments of irritability, and the joy we used to share in small, simple routines felt increasingly strained. I hated seeing her worry because of something that was, in reality, entirely beyond her control. But I couldn't hide my frustration. It had burrowed deep into me, coloring my days and nights alike. I also noticed the effect on my sleep. Nights became restless, filled with imagined scenarios of Karen showing up, of confrontations I hadn't yet had, and of my pool once again overtaken. I would wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, replaying her actions in my mind. My brain refused to switch off, as if every detail of her intrusions had etched itself into my subconscious. Even when I tried to relax, a shadow of tension lingered. What hurt the most wasn't just the physical disruption of my space. It was the emotional weight of helplessness. I felt powerless to enforce the boundaries that I had every right to uphold. It was painful to accept that my words, my requests, my very home weren't enough to keep someone respectful. The injustice gnawed at me, a constant reminder that politeness and patience alone were not sufficient against someone so brazenly intrusive. I began to realize that this wasn't just about pool parties or messy lawns. It was about control, autonomy, and dignity. Karen's disregard for my space felt like a slow erosion of the life I had built with care and attention. Every uninvited visit was a reminder that my efforts to create a peaceful, joyful environment for my family were being dismissed. The anxiety, the tension, the sleepless nights, they all combined into a heavy, almost tangible presence in my life. And yet, in the midst of this pain, a small spark remained, a stubborn desire not to let this situation define me or take away the peace I had earned. I knew I couldn't change Karen overnight, but I also knew I couldn't continue living under this constant strain. That quiet determination simmered beneath the surface, even as the stress weighed heavily on my shoulders. My heart ached, my mind raced, but deep down I understood that the first step toward reclaiming my sanctuary would come from careful planning, patience, and a willingness to confront the situation in a way that was strategic and firm. Even though the sense of helplessness was overwhelming, it was also a turning point. The pain forced me to acknowledge the seriousness of the intrusion, to confront the reality that politeness alone wouldn't protect my home. I realized that to restore the life and peace I valued, I would need to dig deep, gather my resolve, and prepare for the next step, a step that would eventually lead me from suffering to action. One night, after another day filled with anxiety and frustration, I sat by my pool, the water reflecting the soft glow of the patio lights. The night was quiet, almost deceptively calm, as if the world outside my backyard didn't know the turmoil I had been living through. I leaned back on my lounge chair, letting the cool breeze wash over me, and allowed my mind to wander through all the events that had brought me to this point. Karen's constant intrusions, the empty assurances from the HOA, the indifferent shrug of neighbors, it all played in my head like a looping recording I couldn't switch off. And yet, beneath the layers of stress and frustration, a small spark flickered. The realization that if ordinary methods didn't work, I had to think differently. I had to be smarter. It wasn't about revenge or confrontation. It was about reclaiming my space and my peace. I had tried polite conversations, formal complaints, subtle hints, even indirect appeals to her conscience. But none of that had worked. Karen had proven herself audacious, almost impervious to social norms. So, I leaned into strategy. I would act within the bounds of the law and the rules of the HOA, but I would do so with careful precision. I needed to regain control without escalating the situation unnecessarily, and that meant thinking several steps ahead. The first step was observation. I installed small, unobtrusive cameras around the perimeter of my backyard and pool area. Nothing flashy or intrusive, just enough to capture her movements if she trespassed again. Watching the playback gave me clarity and perspective. I could see patterns in her behavior, the times she tended to arrive, the way she moved around the pool, even how she seemed to select which of my possessions to borrow or disturb. Understanding her habits was crucial. Knowledge was power, and now I had it in abundance. Next, I focused on creating subtle deterrents, measures that wouldn't harm anyone, but would make the pool feel less appealing for unauthorized use. I installed small, underwater obstacles designed to be nearly invisible to someone unfamiliar with the pool, but noticeable once in the water. They weren't dangerous, not at all, but they disrupted the comfort of swimming in a way that was intriguing yet effective. It was a gentle nudge, a reminder that this was private property, without needing to confront her directly. I also devised a clever psychological tactic. I staged minor damage around the pool, things that looked accidental but were carefully controlled. A few scattered leaves, a subtly cracked tile in a corner that wouldn't affect safety, and a faint trail of water staining near the pool's edge. Then I left little hints that these incidents were being noticed. Small notes mentioning repairs, casual comments to neighbors about the fragile state of the pool. It was enough to create doubt without causing real harm. Karen predictably found the evidence. I could almost hear her reaction in my mind: frustration, disbelief, perhaps even guilt that she had contributed to this chaos. But the most important aspect of my plan was not the obstacles or the staged damage. It was the mindset shift. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control. The fear that had haunted me began to recede. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was acting. Each step I took, from observing her patterns to setting up subtle deterrents, reinforced the idea that my sanctuary could be protected without breaking rules or losing my composure. My anxiety started to transform into a quiet confidence. I could envision the days when I would once again enjoy my pool fully, without worry or intrusion. The brilliance of the plan lay in its balance. It was assertive, but not aggressive, legal, but cunning, subtle, but unmistakable. It allowed me to establish boundaries without confrontation, to reclaim my space without escalating tension, and to send a clear message that my private property was exactly that: private. Karen's next visit would reveal that I was no longer a passive target, but a calculated guardian of my own sanctuary. As I sat there, listening to the gentle ripple of the water, I felt a weight lift from my chest. Hope, which had been buried under weeks of stress and helplessness, was finally emerging. I knew the road ahead required patience. Karen might test the limits, might push boundaries once more, but now I was ready. I had a plan, and more importantly, I had regained my sense of agency. My sanctuary was not lost. It was simply waiting for me to assert my control. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in the warm night air, feeling the tension slowly dissolve. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about reclaiming peace, protecting what was mine, and setting a boundary that even Karen couldn't ignore. For the first time in weeks, I could imagine a future where my backyard was mine again, a space of calm and joy rather than stress and anxiety. That night, hope wasn't just an abstract idea. It was tangible, deliberate, and within reach. And in that quiet, reflective moment, I realized something important. The fight for peace isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's strategic, patient, and smart. And with that realization, I felt ready to take the next step. A week passed, and for the first time in months, my backyard felt like the sanctuary I had always envisioned. The tension that had gripped me for so long began to lift, replaced by a calm certainty that my home, my pool, and my personal space were once again secure. Karen Wilson had not returned. It was as if the universe itself had acknowledged the careful strategy I had put into place, validating my patience, planning, and quiet determination. The mere absence of her uninvited presence brought a sense of relief that was almost overwhelming. I could finally breathe freely, unencumbered by the constant anxiety of potential intrusions. The HOA had taken notice as well. The hidden cameras, the documented patterns of her visits, and the evidence of repeated violations finally led to an official acknowledgement of the situation. Karen was informed that her actions were in clear violation of the neighborhood rules, and she would now have to adhere to them, or face formal consequences. It was a subtle but profound shift. The power dynamics that had previously left me feeling helpless were now firmly in my favor. The authority of the HOA, combined with my own strategic preparation, had transformed the situation. Karen could no longer casually ignore boundaries or override the space that I had carefully nurtured and protected. With the threat neutralized, the transformation in my backyard was immediate and visceral. The water sparkled under the afternoon sun, reflecting the vibrant colors of the surrounding flowers and the soft green of the lawn. The air carried the familiar scents of summer, fresh-cut grass, blooming jasmine, and the faint aroma of chlorine. The atmosphere that had once been charged with anxiety was now light, open, and welcoming. Every sound of splashing, every ripple across the pool's surface felt like a reaffirmation of control and peace restored. I could hear my children laughing as they played, their voices carrying across the yard without any tension or fear of interruption. My wife, Laura, smiled in relief, knowing that the strain that had weighed on our evenings had finally lifted. The joy of these simple moments was amplified by the knowledge that they were no longer threatened by intrusion. But the triumph went beyond just regaining my private space. There was a quiet pride in knowing that I had resolved the conflict without confrontation, without aggression, and without resorting to anger-fueled impulses. I had relied on observation, patience, and clever strategy, tools that often go unnoticed but are remarkably effective when applied thoughtfully. It was a lesson in the power of calm, calculated action. That even when faced with persistent disrespect or injustice, it is possible to protect oneself and restore balance without compromising integrity. The sense of accomplishment was deep, layered, and profoundly satisfying. Interestingly, my actions resonated with the neighbors as well. I noticed subtle changes in their behavior, an increase in attentiveness to their own boundaries, a renewed respect for the shared spaces we all valued, and a quiet curiosity about how I had managed to turn the situation around. It became clear that my experience was more than a personal victory. It had a ripple effect. Others in the neighborhood were inspired by the idea that sometimes injustice cannot be corrected by patience alone. Sometimes it requires a combination of wit, strategy, and thoughtful action. My journey from frustration to triumph became an example, a silent encouragement for others to protect what was theirs without losing their composure or moral compass. Each time I now approach the pool, there is a renewed sense of purpose and joy. The water is no longer just a place for relaxation. It is a symbol of boundaries respected, strategy executed successfully, and peace reclaimed. When I dive in, the cool liquid surrounds me, a physical affirmation of control and resilience. The sun glints off the surface, and for a moment, all the months of stress, sleepless nights, and anxiety feel distant, like shadows receding before the light of victory. Every ripple, every splash is a quiet celebration of the careful planning and thoughtful action that led to this moment. There is also an emotional depth to the triumph. It is not simply about winning against a difficult neighbor. It is about understanding the importance of self-advocacy, the value of patience, and the strength that can be drawn from clever problem solving. I feel a sense of inspiration that goes beyond the personal. It is a recognition that standing firm in one's convictions, even in subtle ways, can lead to meaningful change. It is a lesson in resilience, one that I carry with me beyond the backyard and into other areas of life. Looking around my backyard now, I see more than just a pool. I see the culmination of months of quiet determination, careful observation, and thoughtful action. I see a space where boundaries are respected, where joy is uninterrupted, and where personal dignity is upheld. The struggle had been real, the tension palpable, but the victory was even more profound because it was achieved thoughtfully, without anger overtaking reason. And so, every time I slip into the water, I am reminded not just of relief, but of pride. Pride in the patience I maintained, the strategy I executed, and the peace I reclaimed. It is a triumph that speaks to the power of intelligence over impulse, of persistence over passivity, and of careful action over chaotic reaction. My backyard is safe, my family is happy, and the lesson is clear. When faced with challenges, courage and cleverness can restore balance, inspire others, and bring a deep, enduring sense of fulfillment.